We have pundits speaking on it from this side of the pond to America, especially with kind of a post-analysis of post-election analysis anyway that we see today. So I'm going to throw it out there. I'm pleasured to be joined by the co-author of this book, Aaron Winter. And thank you for joining me. I just want to kind of ask you straight away the question that is the title of your book: how racism and the populist far right became mainstream. How have we got to where we are?
Well, I guess thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here, and it's an interesting time trying to collect my thoughts as the election has sort of taken place and sort of not really ended.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess that's sort of how long do you have? I think first and foremost, we want to make clear, and I should sort of acknowledge also that as you said, it's a co-authored book. It's me and Aurelien Mondon, and it's part of a wider, bigger project we've been working on that includes many articles and this book. What we're looking at is not so much trying to explain how racism comes into being, but nor that racism is a marginal phenomenon and has become a mainstream one, but the way in which historically racism was, I guess, the defeat of racism has been celebrated many times in the post-war period. And the way in which that has served to distract from and deny the existence of systemic, institutional, structural racism. Oftentimes, the racism that has allegedly been defeated has been in its most, what we call liberal forms: slavery, colonialism, race science,
kind of race-based science. Yes, I just actually watched your lecture on YouTube.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the way it celebrates, or we've celebrated, I say we, and not including myself, obviously, the defeat of fascism in the Second World War, the defeat of Jim Crow segregation in the 60s in America, and much later, the defeat of apartheid. And you often hear this in sort of discussions about racism in Britain, about the way in which things are not as bad as they were in the bad old days of the 70s and 80s, and National Front, etc. And the way in which racism is constantly either diminished or denied by reference to some bad old days and bad old things. Now, that makes it very weird and incredibly revealing when people say, well, back in the day, racism was acceptable. Now, anyone on the sharp end of racism will tell you racism was never acceptable.
It's interesting, the framework, the vernacular that we choose to deploy is very interesting, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And then you say racism was acceptable in the bad old days, so don't destroy a tribute to it in a monument or a statue in the middle of Bristol today. Because, they thought differently then, but I'm still going to defend a slave trader statue and monument. So what we're arguing is that after a period of time when sort of racial progress and post-race narratives have been celebrated, the way in which, and celebrated mostly in a way that displaces racism into the bad old days and the illiberal forms, it pats itself on the back, and this is Britain, America, Canada, many countries, and sort of national collectives, the way it then says, so now that it's over, you regulating my speech is political correctness, or now you can take revenge on me. So what ends up happening is a culture of equivalence, Mary Song calls it culture of equivalence, gets created, and then you have a situation where people are like, well, now racism could affect anyone, and it's not going to affect you because racism is over, so it's going to affect white people. And what ends up happening is you have the construction of often a framework of reverse racism, but it also means that if racism is no longer acceptable, and it's no longer a threat in the imagination of this narrative, then we can talk about it more, and we can have controversial ideas, and we can choose to offend. And what this does, and what me and Aurelien argue, is partly what it's allowed for a reactionary backlash, which has sort of furnished media, popular discussions, political discussions with this idea of that people are not allowed to speak, and people need to be able to speak. They need to be able to express their ideas. And what that often trades in is a notion of sort of racism as free speech, or racism as the democratic right to have and exercise diversity of ideas. So But oftentimes the ideas that are being defended in this framework are often the racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic ones.
Yes.
And I think you have that phenomenon, but you also have another phenomenon, which is liberal racism, which is not
Yeah.
only tied to this free speech narrative that I mentioned, but also the way in which racism becomes sort of becomes disguised in liberal tropes. So it's not anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia, it's the defense of certain values. So it constructs, Islamophobia is completely predicated on this, or has been for a while, that the idea that I can be Islamophobic because I'm a liberal and Muslims or Islam, it's illiberal. And so it gets
Exactly.
put
And
in the
it's what
same
we see.
category
Yeah.
as the illiberal fascism, effectively. And that's, you have these
100%.
terms, Islamofascism, and all these terms that were exercised. And it gives a license to sort of normalize and legitimize and mainstream racist rhetoric and racist discourses that are not totally decoupled from good old-fashioned state racism and the way in which communities can be securitized, the way communities can be criminalized, or communities can be criminalized. And I think part of what we're talking about is the rejection of so-called illiberal racism, often conflated with the far right and rendered either historical or extreme, allows for a liberal racism that opens the door back into normalizing and mainstreaming racism. And at the tip of this is the way in which it also lets in the far right ideas. And I think when we talk about this, I know you have a follow-up question, but I just say this, and I'll we can follow up.
No. I'm loving this. Thank you for
Oh,
this.
cool. I think one of the things happens is that tied to this kind of democratization of bad ideas, effectively, or the free speech argument, is a sort of pseudo-democratic imperative. And this is also what we're talking about when we talk about reactionary democracy. It's not. It's the idea of pushing reactionary ideas under the auspices of democracy. Now, where this becomes incredibly sort of linked to elections is the idea that the ideas that are being posited are been constructed as emanating from the demos, the people, the silent majority. And what's happened in this case is we've used a euphemism for it, populism. We said like these far right parties or these racist political movements aren't racist. They're speaking on behalf of someone. They are speaking on behalf of a insurgent, interruptive, democratic movement that wants to be heard, or democratic sort of community. And what happens with the populism one and where it gets coupled with racism is not just that populism is a euphemism, but oftentimes these ideas and the far right are seen as represented by and representative of the working class, and specifically the white working class or the left behind. And that narrative or discourse posits this imagined community and I say imagined or constructed community because it's not the working class that's being spoken about. It's actually a racialization of the working class as white. It obviously has a sort of nativist identification to it, but it says these people are sick and tired of not being listened to. These people are sick and tired of this. Well, what do they want to hear? Well, it presumes and projects onto them racism and xenophobia. And we've seen this for the past number of years, the way in which the media says, well, we have to have an anti-immigrant movement or an anti-immigrant politician on to represent the views of the left behind. Well, either the left behind is a socioeconomic condition or it's a racial one. Is this group disenfranchised because they're white or because they're working class? And it seems time and time again, politicians in the media treat them as a racist group as opposed to a class group, but uses ideas such as or concepts such as the left behind as a way of often conflating socioeconomic disenfranchisement with sort of ideological and cultural disenfranchisement in ways that politicians can then legitimize their racism
and exploit as well, of course.
And exploit it, but also claim that it's coming from this community, which I have to say, the working class in this country, in America, are not all white, and they're not all
Exactly.
racist.
Of
And
course.
this stigmatizes them. It's not the emancipation of the left behind. It's a further stigmatization of them, and it's often an attempt to lay racism on their door instead of the need for jobs, infrastructure, social safety net. And again, this comes on the back of, in this country, austerity.
Yes. I mean, that is you're giving me so much to unpack there. So I'm gonna kind of just dive right in. The point of, I think, the way you've categorized and the way you've spoken about how politicians have projected this kind of, have created this, and you said, this kind of pseudo construct of, this is the left behind group, and we're just speaking on behalf of the left behind, and we must incorporate the left behind into mainstream. And then that many of times is then equated to being the racist group, or the group that is the identity of a nation, so it were. I'm in agreement with you. But then, would you not say, with, let's say, with Trump's election, what's taking place? Maybe the left behind are not many. Maybe they are far less than the media portrays it as. But there has been a normalization that wasn't there before. A normalization of racism in the public sphere that wasn't there before.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying there are not people who are left behind. I'm not
Mhm.
saying these people are not working class. I'm also saying they're not all white. but
Yes.
and I'm saying that the reasons they're left behind is not because of immigration and multiculturalism or anti-racism. But I guess I would also argue that if you parse the numbers on Brexit and Trump, that the class profile changes, but
Mm,
the racial one does becomes quite clear in terms of
okay.
Trump getting the majority of white votes, but not necessarily the votes of the majority of people who make under 50 or 30,000. And this is, we do an analysis of this in a piece we did in the journal Identities, and then in the book, Aurelien and I. And but what I would say is that, and this goes to the fact that yes, it's a wider demographic than the working class or the left behind,
Yes.
but that wider demographic is also a demographic of white people, white conservatives in the Trump case,
Yes.
but also racists. I guess that's one of the interesting things about the construction of the left behind as the racist vote, is that actually
Yes.
the racist vote is far larger. And what this has done, and I think what Trump has done is, in the previous election, is captured or rode a reactionary backlash where people, for a wide variety of reasons, were fearful of losing their privilege. They may construct themselves as victims, but in large part, the victimization was not because they are white or male or,
Yeah.
you know, heterosexual or a whole bunch of other things. They're the what, I mean, I guess, and it would take far longer to sort of go through this, but like,
Of course. Of
the
course.
idea is the idea is that just because you feel like you're victimized for a certain reason doesn't mean that reason is causing your victimization or you're victimized. It doesn't
True.
necessarily follow. But
No, of course. I saw a quote that said, "When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression."
that's a brilliant one. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But what this did was it takes the construction of a victimization narrative, which I would argue is based on a material level, years of austerity and years of, I mean, in Britain, a longer sort of post-industrialization, and in America, longer post-industrialization, as well as
Yeah.
a loss of empire that people can't seem to let go of. But it's also based on the idea that you can't, I mean, like, at the end of the day, really, is there such a big deal? Oh no, I can't say something racist. I mean, you shouldn't be able to, and you should be afraid to. The idea that you have an argument from the sort of this reactionary discourse that people are somehow left behind socioeconomically and can't say something. Well, I don't think the saying something is that important, and I think it reveals the superficiality and the racism motivating it. But I would
Hundred
say
percent.
this, that the despite the victimization can inform a reaction that it, and if it's given mainstream oxygen,
Yeah.
legitimization, a particular political movement, however small that may be, it can embolden. And I guess we would have to say the difference between, does the emboldening mean that people vote for Trump, or does the emboldening mean that people go out in the street and attack people? or the far right
Mm.
mobilizes. And these are also different phenomena, although interlinked. But the emboldening
Yeah,
is
no,
something we've really seen on multiple levels over the past 4 or 5 years.
exactly. And I feel like that's I don't want to go too much into make it about American and US politics, but I feel like a lot of people on the left as well, or people who I am close to and friends are like, oh, but how can you support Biden and Harris, and with Biden's record and Harris's record, which are
Hmm.
very legitimate contentions with both their records. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I feel like the emboldening of racism in the public sphere and the kind of bolstering of these sentiments is a dangerous one. And I feel like people fail to understand that was an anti-fascist vote when you vote for Biden as opposed to supporting them. And I feel like that was just my kind of take.
No, I mean, yeah, I do see that. And look, this is a really hard one. My instinct, and granted, we've just had a book out that was talking about the dangers of liberal centrism. I want to be able to celebrate the rejection of a white supremacist, fascistic president. And I also want people, particularly on the sharp end of that, to be able to, and I don't want to allow my cynicism and critique get in the way of that. But at the
Yeah.
same time, I mean, now that a couple of days have gone by, I'm sort of like kind of thinking this through in different ways. But I guess we have to see the vote as, and you say it as anti. I agree with you. It wasn't pro Biden, it was anti Trump. And
Yes.
that tells us something because it tells us something that I guess there's three things. It reminds me of, you know, people people oppose the far right, for example, right? Yeah.
Could you incorporate in your answer and your response, sorry,
Yeah.
the numbers overwhelmingly, not overwhelmingly, we still have 70 million for Trump, but it's looking about 75 to 77 million people voted for Biden.
Yeah.
Can we not say that race relations have gotten better, or more people did decide to reject fascism and racism? I would like to, if you could incorporate that in your response.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was sort of, and that's where I was going to get to. So I'll make sure I signpost it. People oppose white supremacy. They oppose the far right. They oppose the
Yeah.
Klan. They oppose the sort of, and this goes to what me and Aurelien describe as illiberal racism. But if what's on offer is a liberalism that sees racism only in those forms and it
Yeah.
celebrates when it's over, what has it addressed or not addressed? So you can hate the far right, but if you hate the far right's racism, do you also hate the hostile environment? Do you also hate everyday
Mm.
bordering? Do you also hate stop and search? Do you also hate counterterrorism and counter extremism policies and practices which securitize, stigmatize, and impact racialized communities? And I guess
Yes.
that's where I'm going with this is the fact that let's take Biden and Harris's win as a vote against white supremacy, as a vote
Yes.
against vile illiberal racism. But let's not think that it has in mind structural reform. Let's not have in mind that it's going to defund the police, I guess. And
Yeah, of course. Of
my
course.
word, especially with considering Biden's role in the '94 Act,
Crime bill.
crime bill, yeah. So I guess the point is this goes to our idea that illiberal racism, the rejection of illiberal racism, however virtuous, doesn't have the teeth it thinks it does if it doesn't see or acknowledge or seeks to conceal liberal racism, and with that structural and
Mm.
systemic racism. And I guess the Biden thing is interesting because in fact the argument for Biden's candidacy was he was electable, not that he was an anti-racist. The
100%.
idea about Biden getting in is that he could get that white working class vote. He could
Yep.
get moderate conservatives. And I guess I would
Yep.
say that if you've already constructed the white working class as racist, which I don't think they are, then why do you think Biden's getting their vote is an anti-racist move? Why do you think if moderate conservatives who have played significant roles along with Democrats in racist imperialist wars,
Exactly.
and he's going to get that, he's going to heal the divided nation? Well, that's not a vote against racism. That's not a fight against racism, and that's not a solution. That may return us to a form of structural and systemic racism that is less loud and sharp on an everyday level, but it
Yeah.
would codify state racism and various forms of racism in everyday policies and practices as opposed to yell and scream and tweet about it. Now, that's not to diminish the horrific fascist policies of Trump. And I am happy they will be ended. But I wanted to go further.
Okay, interesting. On your point of going further, okay, I'm 26 years old, and some of my friends are people I'm acquainted with, or I speak to, or I interact with online, kind of self-identified as Marxists or communists, in many of times, or Marxist-Leninists. Yeah, so they will say things like, and this is where existing in that place of, okay, am I not radical enough? Because I've always kind of said that my philosophy is radical, but my politics is pragmatic. But these guys will say, no, they actually, some people came out and said, no, Trump should win another term. Things need to get bad. They need to get so bad that people will kind of rise up and wake up and finally see the system for what it is and overthrow it. Or there's a revolution. What do you think of that?
I'm assuming from your the way you described it that we probably share the same reaction. I do not think that's a good idea. I wouldn't ever say it. I think that can often come from a very privileged position, despite the politics, because it may not affect you. I'm not saying that about your friends. I'm saying that in a general.
No. And I think that's very important, though.
But I've got friends who say that too. I don't think there's any reason good enough to keep a overt white supremacist fascist in power. And I think the celebrations and the analyses by the communities and the people most affected by his policies say a lot. Yeah. And I think that's really important. We're also in a position now where, and actually a number of people have written about this, that actually there are, on the back of Black Lives Matter and the protests from spring and into the summer, I think that's, I guess, on the back of that, a centrist, liberal politician of compromise really is I find more upsetting, because there was a radical moment that was needed that shouldn't just be a moment. At the same time, it means people have been organizing. It means people have been mobilizing. It means analysis has become sharp and acknowledged and engaged with by the media. And that these things can't be hidden away or shut down. And you're starting to see this. I mean, AOC has been critical of what does the left, what do Democrats do now? And I think that's just brilliant. I think that's great. And you can see how fast the party machine wants to shut her down. Exactly. I mean, she's so right. But I guess one of the things that I find funny, because I think I'm going to comment this, but healing the nation. One thing I saw is that I couldn't maintain my optimism if the first thing comes out and says is we need to heal the divisions, because divisions only mean right and left. They don't mean the deep entrenched social divisions which map directly onto social inequalities and social injustices. Those are what needs to be healed.
100%.
And I don't want making Republicans or making Trump voters feel better in the same way I don't think we should be like debating neo-Nazis or debating sort of racists. We don't need that. Their feelings aren't what matters right now. The people hurt by the policies and practices and rhetoric even need to be dealt with and healed first.
100%. You exist in like the realm of academia. Do you feel like what we're talking about in terms of illiberal racism and liberal racism and people just having a view also saw the rise of what we would say the academics of the right, the Ben Shapiro's, these types of characters?
Just one minor correction. Ben Shapiro would like to think he's a
No, of course he's not. I think it's absolutely terrible. I think it's absolutely terrible. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's interesting because these people are, you have these Ben Shapiro owns this person, and you have these, these right-wing people say, okay, they can deploy the language of like pseudo-intellectualism, and he's their guy, he's their poster boy. Yeah. And you see it as well. This is how, and again, it's so sad. Me as a black person, I see how someone like Candace Owens, who literally knows about nothing, is portrayed and put up and propped up as the black voice of, when you have the likes of Dr. Cornel West, and, you have real intellectuals and academics, but the right chooses people like that. It says a lot about what they think of black people, if I'm honest. But I also ask you, do you think what we're talking about is also a result of this kind of rise in the kind of right intellectualism?
Absolutely. And in fact, there's a section in the book about the sort of reactionary legitimizers. And we call out quite a number of academics and sort of intellectual vanguard platforms, sort of the debating society kind of sort of subculture. Absolutely. And I think there's several interesting things about this. on one hand, yeah, I know I do exist in the realm of academia, but I also like, I'm an immigrant. My family were immigrants. My family were affected by fascism directly and brutally. I mean, I think about these things all the time, but I do have. I guess I would divide these into sectors. Like I think there's an ecosystem in which the
Okay.
academics interact with the popular media intellectual vanguard. So that would be like the Ben Shapiro's, Dave Rubin's, Sam Harris,
Yes.
etc., of this of what was called the intellectual dark web. But it also relies on two things. One is academic legitimization, which is
Yeah.
the data-driven substance that underpins their big words and their rhetoric on
Yeah.
these podcasts and platforms. But it also relies on a mainstream media that keeps on giving these people a platform. I mean, I don't know why Ben Shapiro needs another platform, or why Richard Spencer or Steve Bannon needs another platform. I mean, they
Cool.
they
Okay,
they
that's
have
very
their
interesting. We can talk about the Richard Spencers
yeah,
and the Steve Bannon. I think they're extremists, but
yeah.
someone like Ben Shapiro or Candace Owens, shouldn't? Are you saying they shouldn't be given a platform? Is that like, are you in support of, like, say, deplatforming people?
Yeah, I guess there's two things. And then I will answer your academic question. But I think you can't really deplatform people who belong to a sort of what is effectively a grift. It's an entrepreneurial project.
Yes,
These
one
people are
hundred
paying for
percent.
their own platforms, you know?
Yes,
And, there are, when they do appear at a university, there are protests. I mean,
yeah,
you got to love the irony of this. You have a government in this country, but also in America, which is like, you have to regulate certain people speaking because they can radicalize the youth in universities.
yes.
But you need more far right reactionary racists on campus because that's free speech. And so
Irony.
I think that sort of hypocrisy, that racist hypocrisy, is exposed. But I also think there's reasons why these what they were once called the alt light, effectively, they depend on having their own platforms and circulating amongst each other. So, like Joe Rogan, everyone goes on Joe Rogan or Dave Rubin. These
Yes,
are where the whole community kind of rotates and
yes,
spreads their stuff. But they also depend on deplatforming. They depend on
yes,
the idea, the ability to call everything cancel culture and to act as
yes.
if they've been censored. Now, I do not think that should stop anyone from protesting and deplatforming. But it's important to note that they probably use the terms more than anyone has ever been deplatformed or canceled. I mean, the
Hundred
idea,
percent.
the idea, the idea that someone claims they're canceled and 3 seconds later they're on every bloody platform is
No,
ridiculous.
it's a good talking point. I mean, a lot of the time people on the right will say, "Oh, cancel culture. They want to ban free speech." I mean, Piers Morgan speaks about it, and then James O'Brien said to him, "Like,
Yeah,
who has actually been effectively cancelled? I'm yet to see.
yeah,
If you're talking about not invited to you didn't get invited to a place, or your event got cancelled, then maybe okay, there was gonna the likelihood of something happening at the event." Took into the concern of public safety and they cancelled the event. But you still have a platform, you're still allowed to talk. So who has actually been cancelled? But that's a side point. I do want to get you on the academic in the realm of academia.
yeah. No, and look, I mean, no one has a right to a platform. I mean, and you have this thing called self canceling now, where people go, "I'm going to quit my job because it's so cancelly," or whatever. It's so politically correct, and they go get a better
Yeah,
job. And there's academics doing this too. I think the academic legitimization thing is very, very interesting for several reasons. One is you have a bunch of academics doing this research in
yeah.
prestigious universities, in from prestigious chairs, giving legitimacy to this claim of the left behind and giving
Mm,
these claims. I mean, we all know who we're speaking about with these ideas of national populism and like racial self-interest is not racism. And these people largely have they have their university's impact case studies down pat. I mean, they have the ear of the media and government in a lot of cases, or
mm,
political parties. And I think that what's particularly interesting about that is they do have positions of authority and trust with students. Some often students who are on the sharp end of their discourses and their ideologies, but also they make these claims that they're somehow lone actors in a woke institution. Now, we know, I mean, I'm sorry, universities are not exactly like left wing sort of like utopias. In fact, I think they're, you know, They're pulling out all the stops to represent, just like the sort of the pseudo populist discourses. Like, you make it out like everything is against you and you've been victimized, and you somehow need to fight back or survive in this terrible terrain. Well, partly what's being protested is their racism. It's not their academic freedom. I mean, not only are they given academic freedom, but like in a lot of cases, they're given greater prestige and greater platforms. But it's very disturbing to me to see being in institutions which also are in crisis right now, which are in dire need of being decolonized, that are, we know the stats on professorships and diversity.
Yes.
We know the ways in which universities, very prestigious universities, don't allow a lot of people in from state schools, and we know how that has an impact on their diversity. Then you've got these people in universities claiming that it's this woke, multicultural, politically correct, social justice warrior kind of like place where all that anyone ever teaches is like, I don't know, Robin DiAngelo and Cornell West, or who a couple of them they keep on going through. It's I don't know. I mean, half the time it's very popular books that aren't exactly
Yes.
like, big, heavy academic tomes that cost £150. Yes, I think it's a grift, but it's a dangerous grift because it affects students, it affects
Yes.
universities' reputations, and it legitimizes reactionary racist politics well beyond the doors of the university, which is significant and serious.
100%, and I'm in agreement with you. Just the final two questions then. How different, or what are the marked differences do you think are between the racism we see in the States and the racism we see in the UK?
Oh wow, that's like my favorite topic right now. Yeah, wow. I tweeted the other day about British Britain congratulating America for defeating racism again. I wrote a piece after Obama was elected that was about Britain's response to Obama's election, and it was basically
Yeah.
this celebration of America overcoming its original sin. And I was trying to trace sort of this history of Britain saying America is this racist place and constantly displacing its own racism, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that America has gotten over the legacies of slavery, but
Yeah.
at least there is a recognition that it is, and this is a complete self mythologization. It's a narrative that helps displace and ignore systemic racism and the legacy of
Yeah.
slavery. It thinks it was a bad idea or bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the official narrative. Britain hasn't been convinced colonialism was a bad thing. It's
That's
still
very true.
celebrating it. It's still giving
Yep.
honors in its name.
I think you're a mind reader because every point, my next question about to be about colonialism and statues and
Oh
and
yeah.
Britannia rules the world. So you're always mentioning what I'm about to say, but yeah, please do carry on.
It's this idea that somewhere else is racist. I don't know if you've seen, and I remember teaching this when I taught history when I was a postgraduate student, about the way in which the current affairs, British Army magazine, gave guidance to British soldiers how to deal with black soldiers who came over as part of the American Army.
Okay.
And there's this whole thing about how the British have never seen something so horrible as the way Americans treat black people. Racism is as foreign to us and it's like, it's absolutely unbelievably ridiculous. But
Yeah, of course.
it's a historical narrative that's so cemented that it allows for Britain, just like, the post-race narrative allows people to say that racism is defeated so I can act how I want. Well, America can serve that purpose for Britain. The way it says we're not as bad,
Mm.
or they're what they do is racism. What we do is, sorry, look over there again. And I have to say this as a Canadian, I grew up in a place that said, "Oh yeah, racism
I
to
was
the
gonna
wall."
ask where your accent is
Yeah,
from,
that's
actually.
right. Yeah, I don't know what my accent sounds like anymore because I've been here for over 20 years, and a
Oh
lot of
wow,
my
okay.
television growing up was American. But and when I lived in Scotland, racism was in England. So
Yes.
it's and I mean, there's many other countries. I hear this, France is the racist place, or this is the racist place, and it always seems to be a displacement and deflection to stop talking about racism where you are. And I
Mm.
think that, I mean, one caveat to that analysis, or one additional qualification is that's not saying the place that's being labeled as racist isn't racist.
Yes,
But
of course.
what it is saying is the place that's doing that displacement is refusing to acknowledge its complicity in racism, its racist system. And I think that has sort of decorated the discussion. I do think that what's interesting now, and I do think that racism in Britain is both very overt, very deeply embedded, and very much practiced every day in policies, practice, rhetoric. I mean, the reporting over the past number of years about immigration and Muslims has been horrific. The deportation of people, the Windrush scandal, Grenfell, the idea that racism isn't just here, but it's so deeply embedded, it's so in our structures, institutions, and systems. The idea that people can say, well, oh, the National Front back then, well, that was racism, and ignore all these things is quite shocking. So to say, look over there when you had go home vans in a hostile environment, or some of the things that Priti Patel has said about refugees and migrants is just unbelievable. But we'll see what happens, because now we have a situation where Boris Johnson is seen as the racist and Biden is seen as the anti-racist. And we'll see where that goes in terms of the special relationship, but we'll see where that also goes in terms of our discussions and our understanding and our ability to challenge and resist racism.
100%. I find it very interesting. Echoing what you said, I had people say to me, for example, that I wasn't a racist until BLM came about. You hear that a lot. You hear that a lot. Oh, I was fine. I was absolutely fine. But then, I've actually spoken to some people, and the more you kind of probe it, you realize, I don't know, I had Baroness Barsi on not too long ago, and she kind of said the same thing. The more you probe it, a lot of people, it's this thing of like, their kind of gripe is the world is changing, and women don't know their place anymore. Black people don't know their place anymore. People don't know and that's where a lot of it stems from. I've seen it's just like, oh, the world is changing. People don't know their place anymore. People are asking for equality, and therefore that's my gripe, which I think is absolutely ridiculous.
So that raises an interesting issue, though. Like that's fascinating, because in a sense, then how do you explain young racists?
Exactly,
and how do you go? So the world is changing. I don't like the way it's going. And then when someone says something racist, they go, "Well, it used to be acceptable when I was." You can't use that as a defense. And it's a very weird. It's very like, well, the world changed, so I wasn't told about this. I've been complaining about it for a while. It's a very funny way. I always find racists play with time in interesting ways. Racists can celebrate their nation's progress and then complain if they weren't as free as they used to be to say these things.
Exactly. And you read my mind once again. My next question was literally, what would you say to someone? What's the issue of a nation celebrating its heritage? Obviously, I know I'm going to say, well, that heritage includes the massacre and genocide of people. But, people will say that, you had Jacob Rees-Mogg play Britannia Rules the Waves in Parliament as some kind of victory for heritage and, Queen and country kind of thing. But, people do say, and this is many people who are British or English white will say, well, I just feel like everyone else can celebrate their culture, but I can't. Everyone else can celebrate their heritage, but this is my heritage, or this is what we want to be remembered for, which again, I find very strange. You want to be remembered for these things, but how would you respond to that?
I guess the thing is that like, it's one thing to say everyone else can celebrate their thing, but I can't. But we're living in a country where no one stopped playing Real Britannia. It's just that the reactionaries and the racists decide that they want to politicize it. It was already political. I already oppose it, but that's not the point. The point is that it's still played. We still have we still do the honors lists, and they're in the sort of the front pages of the newspapers every year. We still have a lockdown so we preserve Christmas. I mean, I don't know. I didn't get to spend my religious holidays with my family. I didn't get. I know Muslims weren't able. How is Diwali affected? I guess that's the thing about saying, losing privilege. The perception doesn't necessarily match the reality, but it becomes currency for political reaction and backlash. And, political parties. Like, no one bans Christmas. I have to read about it every year. And now
Exactly.
you have a government who banned everything so we could have Christmas. People are still going to
Exactly.
complain someone's trying to ban Christmas, or someone's going to get angry that I said, "Oh, you want to ban Christmas." It's a ban Christmas. But you also want to have other communities celebrate their holidays, and you also don't want to have these conspiracy theories and these myths played out all time and time again. Like, I think there's reactionaries, but I think there's also kind of conservative nationalists who, the reactionaries may look for opportunities to mobilize based on a perceived or real threat to some kind of heritage sign, signifier, or monument.
Yes.
There's also other people go like, "Oh, what if they take away this?" Well, it hasn't been taken away. I mean, the celebration, the sort of Remembrance Day, and all these kind of things are very conservative institutions and rituals, and they're not seen as political. They're seen as apolitical, and we can't even have a discussion about the legacies these draw from and memorialize and often conceal, and the harm that certain things conceal, without being told we're trying to ban this or ban that.
It's actually it's a strange irony that the right would say, "But oh, you lot want to shut down public debate," but then when it's their things, it's almost like, well, there can be no debate on these things, and I find that very interesting.
Let's have a discussion how they feel about prevent. I mean, it's like there are real policies and practices that want to check, suspect, and stop people from expressing themselves. But there is a level of conservative and reactionary fantasy that thinks that this every ritual, memorial, monument in this island is going to be destroyed or pushed to the sea or whatever. I mean, people were guarding statues that weren't even like, no one else noticed.
No, and I witnessed that. There was a statue in where I grew up in Birmingham. There's a statue that I couldn't even tell you who the person was. I don't know anything about him, but there was like a good 20 men outside gardening. I'm thinking this person's not even like, no one even knows who this person is. No one's gonna come to Birmingham in the middle of Birmingham in this park to deface the statue. I can promise you that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find interesting, this goes back to the beginning with the sort of mainstreaming of the far right. We have to remember that there are people in parliament, so the far right that may be guarding these things, and the people getting angry in front of their televisions,
Yes.
and people in parliament are all converging on this defense of tradition, defense of racist statues. And this is
Yeah.
where the problem becomes. I mean, I found it reporting on far right demonstrations or defenses of statues very problematic in the way that the narrative made it out to be extremists, or they were quite classist representations. And they weren't alone. They had the legitimacy and legitimization of mainstream conservative media, liberal media, people in government. And that's not to say that they're all extremists or they're all mainstream. They occupy different positions. But the defense of statues of slave traders somehow is something that all these sectors can come around together and converge on, is fascinating, and it's so problematic. In addition to
100%.
how bad the existence of that statue is.
Exactly. I mean, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you once again for your time. Again, I would tell people I'm going to post Dr. Aaron's Twitter handle in the comments. People can check him out on Twitter and follow his tweets, which I also do. People can also purchase Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. What else are you working on? How can people read more about your works and kind of follow you?
Just some of the things we were discussing. We have some number of articles out in ethnic and racial studies, articulations of Islamophobia, is in sort of on the racialization of the working class and populism in the US, the UK, and identities. We've written for sort of Open Democracy, Jacobin, The Independent, and we've got a number of things coming out, both independently and together, that
Awesome.
I'll post on Twitter as they come out, including a chapter on the Guardian's reporting about racism.
Okay, that should be super interesting. I'm looking forward to that one.
Katie Brown and Aurelien.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much for
very
your
much.
time. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.